Welcome back to another episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today's guest is Sara Kuburic. Sara is an existential psychotherapist, she's a writer, she's a consultant, and a columnist for USA Today. Many of you know her as millennial.therapist on Instagram, and this is her third time on the podcast. And I know I've said this before, but what I love about Sara's content is that she takes complex issues that can be hard to talk about, such as mental health, relationships, and dating, and creates content that makes these issues easy for people to understand and also inspires people to learn and grow along the way. I think you're really going to appreciate this convo with Sara, as we kept it super organic and we covered a lot of ground on dating, relationships, etc., and so much more. So let's get this conversation going and welcome Sara Kuburic back to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Sara, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me again.
I'm so excited. This is our third conversation, and I really enjoy talking to you. I value the friendship that we've kind of built online. And one of the other things that I really have enjoyed seeing from you lately is that you've been really going hard. You've been going hard on social media as far as trying to get people to take radical responsibility and accountability for certain things that they can control. And with that said, there's a lot of information out there as far as relationships. What are would you say are three relationship truths that nobody wants to hear, but they need to hear?
I like how I'm the person you go to for things people don't want to hear, but I'm going to say them anyways. Great. I think that sometimes, truth number one, we sometimes do ask too much. And I think, as you said, there is this culture online of making sure our needs are met, making sure that we set those boundaries, making sure that our desires and wants are being heard, and all of that is fantastic. However, no one talks about the fact that sometimes we do ask for unreasonable things, and sometimes it is too much. So, two examples I often give is one, asking your partner to fulfill all your needs. That's just not possible for them to do, nor is it their role or job to do. And second is asking your partner to fulfill a need that's actually yours. So you can't give them the responsibility of having a fulfilling life. That's really on you. And so I think these are the two categories we fall into when asking, way too much of our partners.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, I think people have a hard time though deciphering between the two. What are my needs that I have to make sure I'm filling in the relationship, and then how do I articulate or ask for and identify what the needs are from our partner to help me in the relationship? So how can somebody decipher between the two?
Yeah, that's great. I think the first question is, can I do this myself? Do you know what I mean? Can I do this myself? And is this something that the other person even has the capacity to do? I think sometimes we don't even ask that. For example, a lot of people want their partner to make them happy, to be their source of happiness, to fulfill this need and make their life meaningful and fulfilling. So that's great. And your relationship should definitely be a source of happiness and fulfillment, but one source of happiness and fulfillment. You are then responsible to make sure that there's other areas of your life where you also derive meaning and happiness from. And so I think it's important to go, am I pulling my weight? If I'm not feeling happy, okay, maybe I can talk about my partner and my relationship needs, but are there other areas in my life that I can maybe work on that can bring me a bit more meaning and fulfillment? And I think maybe even talking to your partner of what are the needs you think you can help me with, and what needs do you need me to help you with? And then also having a very candid conversation of your partner can't fulfill all those needs. You can't fulfill all those needs. Sometimes you need more people. You need friends. You need mentors. And so it's making it very clear of hey, I'm actually going to reach out to this person, and hey, I'm going to have a girls' night because I need more connection, more friendship. And so just being really honest about different degrees of needs and who's taking on one responsibility and what you're doing to fulfill them with that person and with others.
Well, it makes sense because I think a lot of it comes down to communication, right? And I think it's comes down to establishing what we know we want for ourselves, what we want in a relationship, and then, like you said, identifying certain things that can be done ourselves, and then articulating that in a way to the person that we're potentially dating. And I want to get back to unpacking two more of these truths, but I think first, a good thing though, I think to build on top of this is people have a hard time being vulnerable. And I think that goes alongside with communicating your needs to your partner is being vulnerable and potentially knowing that person might not be able to meet those needs. That person might find out something about you that maybe they didn't know, that maybe you think could be bad, or whatever the case may be. Like, what is your advice to people, or what have you done in the past to help embrace vulnerability to be able to communicate effectively with a partner?
Yeah, so look, I think vulnerability is really important, but I think we also have created a culture of forced vulnerability, and just be careful not to do that. No one is entitled to your vulnerability, and not everyone deserves your vulnerability. Vulnerability should be offered when there is a sense of safety, right? Vulnerability within itself has a degree of risk. Of course, you might be rejected. Of course, the person might not respond well. It might be really painful for them, whatever it is. And so that's what makes vulnerability vulnerability. However, you also have to look at the bigger context and go, is this a safe enough space for me to take a risk? Is this a worthy enough cause for me to take that risk? So just assessing that, I think, is really important, because sometimes we are vulnerable with people that don't deserve it or can't handle it, and then it can be quite painful. But if you are in a safe space and you are trying to practice that vulnerability and it's really, really hard for you, I think it can boil down to figuring out, do you accept those parts of yourself? Sometimes we're so scared to say it because if they reject it and you've already rejected that part of yourself, who's going to accept you? And so really going and saying, I'm about to say something really vulnerable. How do I feel about what I'm going to say? How do I accept this part of myself? Do I struggle with it? And have that conversation and see if you can kind of build some comfort level even with yourself, maybe before you share it with somebody else.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say is, A, don't force vulnerability. Like, don't fall into the trap of just posting stuff online, or even just opening up just for the sake of opening up. Like, have a goal in mind as far as, like, where is this going? Is this going to move you forward in your life or in the relationship? And then make sure you get to a place with yourself that you're comfortable enough with how you're going to deliver this message or this part of you, that you can accept yourself for it before asking somebody else to accept that part of you. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes others will be able to accept it more than you will, of course. But if you feel that resistance to even say it, then maybe to help you get over that hurdle, you can go, oh, this is my inner resistance. I'm projecting on this person that they'll reject it because maybe I'm rejecting it. But we have to remember that the degree of vulnerability dictates the degree of intimacy. So you need to understand, like, if you want that intimacy, you will have to have that degree of vulnerability. And so understanding, as you said, like what that goal is and what they understand the purpose of vulnerability is. If they understand it also as building intimacy, then that's really beautiful.
And I think when it comes to like being vulnerable, what also can happen is when you open up and you share what you want, and maybe that other person isn't receiving of that, then that might be a good time for certain people to walk away from the relationship. But a lot of people don't, right? And a lot of people will continue to ride this relationship out because they think they're going to be able to convince that person to potentially accept that part of them. Like, why do you think so many people fall into that trap despite knowing that this person might not be accepting them or might not be aligned with them as far as what they want in the relationship?
I think sometimes we're trying to, it's, wanting what we can't have kind of mentality of either we're entertained by the prospect of changing someone's mind and it's, thrill of the pursuit and excitement, or maybe part of it is we're trying to heal a much deeper wound of, if I can convince this person that I'm good enough and they want me, then I have worth, then I'm worthy. If someone recognizes my worth, then it must be there. And if they don't recognize it, it must not be there. And so we try so hard to convince this person as a way to validate that we're worthy of love and desire and attention and all these good things. And we are just, picking the wrong people to do it with. Because I understand this inherent need to do those things, to be like, I need to feel loved and deserving and all this stuff. But we often find people that, are not willing to give it to us. And sometimes that comes from, childhood patterns of, growing up not having your needs met. So now you're reenacting that by choosing people that are not going to meet your needs because you don't know what it feels like to have your needs met. And maybe that even makes you slightly uncomfortable. But I think all of that leads to like the second truth in relationships that people don't want to hear, which is sometimes we're just asking the wrong person. And we need to be okay with that some people are either unwilling or incapable of giving us what we need. And it doesn't matter if it's unwilling or incapable. The distinction doesn't matter because the outcome is exactly the same.
And I think a lot of times it's so hard to walk away from situations like that because our ego gets in the way, our sense of self gets in the way, and we want to try to like win that prize, right? It's like we want the thing that we can't have, we almost want it more, right? We're spending so much time trying to convince people why we're worthy of being in a relationship with that person or how we are truly aligned, even though there's so much that's wrong with that. And I think one of the things that gets overlooked a lot is this notion of personal accountability when it comes to relationships and choosing a partner. And that kind of goes in line with what you just said. It's just accepting the fact that that person's just not your person, right? And it's not that person's fault. If you proceed, it's your fault for choosing somebody, continuing to choose somebody, even though
Who's not
you knew from the
choosing
beginning
you?
that it wasn't a match.
Who's not choosing you?
Right. And so why do you think personal accountability gets so overlooked when it comes to relationships when really like that's the one thing that is going to help somebody discover and maintain true love?
Yeah, I mean, you put such a great question. I think relationships are hard enough and life is just hard enough. That one of the reasons it's so hard is because we make it hard. No one wants that truth. No one wants to go, okay, this relationship didn't work out because of the way I showed up. Or, hey, I have a pattern of individuals I choose that are just not right for me and I keep doing it anyways. They would rather go, the apps are shit. Every man, every woman, like it doesn't matter. Everyone is just terrible. There's no one to date on this planet. And it's just easier not to take accountability because if we take accountability, then we have to create change. And as you know, humans don't always love creating change. They don't always love being like, oh, what can I do better? And that's, I totally get that. It's not even an ego trip. It's just you protecting yourself. It's hard. And the issue is, though, that a lot of the things we do, we think that we're being passive when even our passive actions are actually quite important. So, yes, maybe they apologize, their behavior doesn't change, and you see in the relationship, and maybe staying in the relationship is considered passive. But you're still choosing to go back to this person after every time they've apologized and then hurt you over and over and again. And at some point, them hurting you has to become your responsibility because you kept coming back.
Right. And I think once you're able to, accept that, I mean, also, I think you have to accept the fact that just some people do treat you like crap, and that's reality, and that is on them.
Absolutely.
Right. And I don't want to discredit that, but I think you brought up such a good point in that, like, the moment we're able to move past that part and just accept it and be like, you know what, that person just was not for me. They were a jerk. I don't want to tolerate that anymore. And then take some sort of accountability and responsibility for your part in this and maybe how you can do better next time. I think the game changes. And this is something from my own personal experience where somebody posed this question to me and they were like, Doug, have you ever asked yourself, like, what was it about you that not only attracted this type of thing into your life, this type of relationship, but allowed it to continue? Like, what was that about you? And, in the moment, you're like, I don't want to hear that. But then you take a second to pause and you're like, man,
Nothing.
you're just like, they're, they're, you're right.
Like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I'm perfect.
Yeah.
But I think once you get past that, there's so much growth that happens, Sarah, because you're able to kind of look at this in such a different light and saying, all right, like I do have control over this. Like I do have control over my emotions. I do have control over my choices when it comes to relationships. And I'm going to choose differently moving forward, right?
I absolutely love that. I think it's great. And of course, it's not your fault if someone mistreats you. I think we're just talking about what do you do once someone does. And I love that you said, like, once I was willing to see my own flaws and how I was contributing to these patterns, then growth happened. Because that's, the only way we'll change anything is if we become aware of it.
And I would love to know your thoughts on this. And do you think that a lot of the times what happens is people get crushed after a breakup, no matter how the relationship ends, whether it's infidelity, whether it's just a classic breakup, whether it's something happens where they're just forced not to communicate anymore, whatever the situation was, breakups are hard and people's self-esteem gets brought down pretty far below baseline. And so unless they're willing to work on themselves and raise it back up, I think it's easier to continue to blame the other person because when you have such low self-esteem, in my experience, it's hard to want to admit that you did something wrong. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, of course. I think it's up self-preservation. I'm trying to think of my past relationships of like being willing to admit just the degree of faults that you that you have in that dynamic, and usually comes like years later we're like, oh, I see what I did there, like I was a walking red flag and I did not even realize it. And I think yeah, I self if you're struggling with your self-esteem, it might be a bit of self-preservation not to see your own fault, which is, totally fair. I also think maybe people just told you that, if you were gaslit to the extent where a person's like, you're terrible and you're not good enough, as a way to offset that, you might go like, no, I, did everything right. And blah. And so whenever you have any extremes, usually the truth is lost, because the truth is somewhere in the middle in any relationship, usually. Of course, again, not talking about abuse here, this can be really misconstrued, but like if your partner had a narrative of that you were like a terrible girlfriend, and then you actually had to convince yourself that you weren't a bad girlfriend and you weren't a bad girlfriend, that was a good thing. But in that narrative of convincing yourself that you are still a good person, maybe you didn't leave enough space to go like, but I'm a good person and here are my areas of growth. Does that kind of make sense? It's like when we're trying to like create a narrative to protect ourselves, there's sometimes self-awareness that's lacking.
Yeah, and I think that also goes along the lines of when someone's cheated on, where they feel their self-esteem is completely shattered, right? And it's just hard to kind of contextualize the whole situation and try to recover and trying to, ask questions on like why it happened and so on and so forth. I mean, what advice like do you have for people,
That's such a good example.
yeah, that are just completely crushed?
Yeah, because it's like, it's not your fault they cheated. Let's make that very clear. It is not your fault they cheated. However, it does not mean you were perfect in that relationship and you didn't do things that weren't good for that relationship. And I think being able to hold both is so, so difficult because we're so betrayed and so hurt. But I think the true growth is in the end of like what they did was unjustifiable, painful, so and so. And the way I showed up in the relationship, even it doesn't mean they were correlated. It just means that they both existed at the same time. And you're not admitting this so that you can, make them feel less guilty. You're not even going to tell them maybe that you're realizing what your faults are. But the point is just to be honest with yourself so that you can learn and you can grow and you can show up differently in other relationship. No one's asking you if you've been cheated on to look at, your fault as a way to like make the other person feel better. It's really just for you.
Yeah. So would you say that like a big part of growth for somebody who has been cheated on, specifically recently, I guess, is to like acknowledge that the cheating obviously wasn't that person's fault and it was on that other person, but maybe like taking some time to reflect and say, okay, like what were some of those signs that I may have seen before, or how could I have shown up better? And then being able to apply those lessons to the future. Is that where the growth happens?
I mean, where the growth happens, and regardless if it's like, did I see the signs that they were cheating or that there was a need met? Again, like, unless they explicitly told you and you explicitly decided to ignore it, again, it really wasn't on you. But I think it's more like, I can't just chuck this relationship to them being a villain. Maybe you were in this relationship for 15 years. Maybe it was 3 years. But if the whole thing boils down to they're an asshole who cheated on me, then that whole relationship is going to become somewhat meaningless. And all the lessons that you could have learned over the 15 years, you would have almost wasted. And so I don't even think the lessons have to be about infidelity. That feels like too close to home, but just lessons of like, okay, putting that aside, is there anything I could learn? Any way I could grow for my next relationship? So just not, throwing it all away if you can for your own benefit.
And along the same lines of infidelity, I want to talk about monogamy because that's something that's talked about a lot now. And I think with social media and dating apps and just accessibility, I think it's a lot easier to be attracted to multiple people at once and multiple people while you're in a relationship. So do you think that monogamy is still realistic given the times that we're in, or do you think that we are going to eventually phase out of it?
Putting me in the hot seat, aren't you? No, I honestly think it depends on your personality. Just because you might be attracted to people while in a relationship does not mean that you now want a non monogamous relationship. Being attracted to people you're not in a relationship with is also very normal. The difference is, do you want to pursue a relationship with multiple people, or do you want to have intimacy with multiple types of people? And so it's really, I think it's great that we're talking about it. I think it's great that people don't think there's only one way to love and feel loved and that they can see what works for them. But I don't think monogamy is going to go away, because I think for some people, the level of intimacy and commitment and work, because relationships are work, they're kind of done with one and they're okay with one. And I think that that's okay. So I just think we have more options now. Being monogamous is not cool anymore. I feel like that's what the trend is now telling us. It's not cool. But I think eventually, just like anything, it's just going to be one of the options that people either choose or don't choose. And there's definitely benefits to it. And there's obviously setbacks to it, just like any relationship dynamic.
Yeah, in my opinion on the whole thing is you have to do what works for you. And if you're happy, great. But getting back into the hard hot seat question on monogamy, and then again, this is just me just asking just generically, like, do you think that the part of the reason that monogamy has become less popular is because we live in a world where people are more impatient, they're more distracted, they're less focused, and monogamy takes so much work that it's easier to not be monogamous and to just focus on multiple relationships?
I'm sure there is a part of that. I also think there's a part of we're finally free enough to explore different dynamics in relationships where people feel safe enough to do so. So I'm sure, some people would have wished to have been monogamous centuries ago and weren't, or whatever. Like, I think part of it is just human nature, and part of it is the culture we're living in of instant gratification. And I think what's interesting is that the dating apps seem to have dehumanized people. And it's almost like shopping for humans, as I've heard people say. And that just like made my soul cringe so hard. And I just was like, oh, I need to like wash my soul out somehow after that statement. But I think that's literally what it is. But I think we've kind of forgot about the soul aspect of humanity. And again, some will argue that it doesn't matter and it's purely physical, so on and so forth. But I think with the way that we're approaching everything in life, from ordering food to sliding into people's DMs and the instant gratification, of course, that's going to spill over into how we build relationships.
Right. And I agree. I think there's obviously a big part of it that people feel more free just because of the way society has progressed, and they're able to explore things potentially, or they're able to explore things that they haven't been able to potentially explore in the past. But as far as you personally, like, what are your like relationship like views? Like, are you somebody that leans towards monogamy? Is that what you look for?
I love how, wow, we're getting personal. Yeah, I definitely lean towards monogamy. Monogamy is my jam, but I very much understand that it's not everyone's, and I deeply respect that. I think one person at a time is enough work, so I'm good. But I also have to understand that it's probably, my upbringing and all these other cultural narratives that have shaped these beliefs and these tendencies now to be monogamous. And I'm not going to claim it's, the only way to do things, but it's just from how I was raised to, the culture I'm in and how I operate as a human. That's what works for me. How about you, Doug? I
What
mean,
am I? Yeah, come on, you can grill me too.
yeah,
I don't
I
care.
mean, what is this?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think sometimes it's people want to know like who's the face behind like the quotes and stuff. And I know you post some, reels and content, but I mean, a lot of your content is just, quotes. And I think people would appreciate kind of knowing a little bit more stuff
Yeah,
about you
knowing all the
personally.
secrets. But tell me, Doug, are you monogamous? Is that what you lean towards?
Yeah, I mean, personally, like I love monogamy. I love chivalry. I love being monogamous with somebody. I think that's just something that is my jam and that I thrive on. I love building like a deep, meaningful connection with a single human being and building off of that. But and also, like I mentioned before, like I'm also supportive of however other people want to live their lives and however they want to engage in relationships. And as long as somebody else is happy and they're healthy and they're then that sort of thing, then I don't care. Like doesn't that kind of stuff doesn't bother me. And I honestly like talking to people who have different views on that because I'm always looking to continue to learn and grow and understand. Like
Maybe we'll change our minds. I mean, like, that's
maybe
another
I
thing of
don't
like,
know.
who knows? Like, maybe ask me in like a year and I'm like, nah, monogamy's out. Like, no, don't know.
I think that's important too to be able to change your views on certain things and be able to evolve. I know for me specifically with like religion, I've definitely evolved my views. Like I went from somebody who hated religion, hated God, to becoming like a born again Christian, to thinking that was going to be my only form of like quote unquote faith. And I am still a Christian. However, I also embrace things like other forms of spirituality, getting out in nature, meditation, like all these things that I didn't think I would actually appreciate when I became a Christian. So, I mean, yeah, I guess people have to always be open to learning and evolving and seeing where that takes them in life.
Exactly. I love that. I think I talked about that on Instagram like a couple days ago. Don't overcommit to any one version of yourself because the whole point is to grow and evolve. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about.
It is. And I think that's just it, right? And I think going back to our relationship truths, I think the only way to grow and to evolve, as we spoke about the first truth, is to be comfortable communicating what you potentially would need from a partner and also being able to have self awareness about what you can bring to the table for yourself and the things that you can take care of for yourself. Like that is going to help you grow. The second thing is learning that you might be asking the questions to the wrong person and that that person might not be your person, and learning to walk away from that will help you evolve and break some potential unhealthy patterns. So what would you say is another like relationship truth that might be hard for people to hear that will actually help them grow?
Yeah. So sometimes we get in our own way. I think this really feeds into like the responsibility conversation we had of, the relationship might not be working out not because of something your partner did, but because of your own fears, wounds, insecurities, projections. Maybe you are the biggest obstacle of the relationship. Maybe, you're not allowing yourself to be happy or to ask for the things that you want or even receive the things that are being given to you. And some of us are so used to or familiar or comfortable with being unhappy that that's kind of the place we retrieve back to. And so we just need to know, what are our beliefs about happiness? Do we deserve that? Are we an obstacle in our own relationship? Because sometimes we get in our own way. And that's super hard to detect, but I think it's a truth that's worth talking about.
It's also a buzzword, self-sabotage, that we hear
Self-sabotage, yes.
a lot about. But I think in this example, it's actually like plays into this quite well because that tends to happen, right? Is we end up getting in our own way and self-destructing and destructing something that could be potentially good. Like, how could somebody be aware, first of all, they're actually sabotaging something before it starts or sabotaging themselves? And then how can they sidestep to try to avoid, making that same mistake?
I mean, it's super hard. I think you'd have to be really aware of the fears and triggers you have about relationships. I think obviously if you were super aware of the self-sabotage as it was happening, you're probably not likely to do it. It's just that most of us are unaware in the moment. What can help is just looking at your pattern across all your relationships, be it platonic or romantic or sexual or familial, it doesn't really matter. But like, do I have a pattern of something? Like, for example, I used to have a pattern of not communicating until in my head the relationship was over, in terms of like I've had enough, and then you will hear what has upset me. But for like years I'll just sit there and I won't say anything, and so then I will blow up, and by the time, and the person will often be like really great about it. They're like, great, so let's work on this, and I'm like, I'm already over it, in terms of I'm over the relationship. And so if I communicated that earlier, we probably could have worked through it. But because I waited to be so exhausted and so over the relationship before I had the courage to communicate it, it killed the relationship. And I've done that several times until I had to go like, oh, this is my form of self-sabotage. I ensure the relationship doesn't work by not communicating. And yes, there were fears and all this stuff that was, leading to that and that caused that, but it was still a choice. And so I look at patterns is all I want to say. If you have a pattern, you have some history, that's often a really good way to show you how you self-sabotage.
Sarah like brings like a book, to her partner, and he's like, "Oh man, I knew you were working on a book." She's like, "No, no, this is everything that I'm mad about in the relationship."
Yeah, enjoy that. Or I was just like, I'm not feeling this anymore. And they're like, why? I'm like, well, all these reasons. And they're like, well, you never communicated that previously. I'm like, yeah. So, and yeah, it took a lot of work and maturity to be like, oh, yes, communication, beautiful, very needed.
Right. And I think this also goes back to our conversation or our thread around being vulnerable and opening up with communication, because that like is the foundation of all of this, is being able to be vulnerable throughout the process of the relationship to be able to communicate when something's not right, or you're not feeling happy about something, or you feel like maybe you guys are misaligned or whatever. And then it comes back to having self acceptance in yourself that you are so clear that this is actually true and then in line with what you're actually feeling, and then being able to relay that to your partner in a way that's effective.
And this is hard too, because when I look at that version of Sarah, that was like my early 20s, teens, early 20s, right? Like a decade ago. like, and what we have to understand is that these skills take time, and it takes time to know who you are and what you want and need. And so you can't communicate it until you know. And that's why relationships in your 20s can be so rough sometimes. And of course, always. But it's just also people, if you have a younger demographic that might be listening to this, it's okay. Like, it's hard to know these lessons, and you often have to live through some, shitty breakups and relationships before you learn them. And that's just kind of part of life. Yeah. I look at my 20-year-old self and I'm like, I have grace for you, because I understand how scary vulnerability was and how you weren't even aware of your needs. So asking for them was almost impossible.
And I think another way people self sabotage is when they get clear on what they want in a relationship and they acknowledge that past relationships were a reflection of their familiar patterns, maybe from childhood, and then like they go into something new that seems a little unfamiliar. And I think we may have touched on this already, but I want to go a little deeper. All they will push that away and sabotage that. I'll give you a perfect example of something that's happened not really recently, but it's happened in my life with when I've dated women, where you'll be out with somebody, you get to know somebody, and they'll say, I really want a guy who texts me in the morning, who wishes me a good morning, who's super kind, who is always like trying to plan stuff, blah, 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 right? And then the moment I start doing those things, it's like if the person disappears. And I think that's common to where it's like, yeah, I want you to text me good morning. And then when you do, you're like, oh, this is so weird. Like, why is he doing that? Like, how can the person who's doing that, how can they take a different path in those moments where it's potentially triggering them and becoming very unfamiliar, so that they're able to kind of let their guard down a little bit and just see where that goes?
Yeah. And so it doesn't confuse the shit out of you, that too. So yeah.
Yeah.
I think if you're asking for something that's unfamiliar to you, you need to understand it's going to be weird or uncomfortable. Like, you need to be honest with yourself of like, I'm asking for this because I think it's going to be really cool and great, and because I've heard it's really healthy from like a psych I follow on Instagram or something. But like, I don't actually know how it's going to feel, and it might not feel as good as I think it's going to feel. And part of that is just building a new familiar space. However, you also have to give yourself grace of like, maybe I won't like that. I think I'll like that, but maybe I won't. And having the foresight to communicate like, hey, I actually had a relationship where communication wasn't great. I would love it if a guy would text me in the morning and like check in throughout the day. I'm not super familiar with this. I'm not sure if I'm going to love it, but theoretically, I think I will. And so kind of saying to this person, we're exploring this need or this desire or this want together. Now, that takes a lot of self-awareness and communication, but hopefully, you can come to a space where you can do that.
Yeah, because I think what ends up also happening is potentially the person just doesn't even answer you. And then you're like, I've been left like wondering, like, did I like spell morning wrong? Like, what happened,
Yeah.
And
No, it's not
I
even your fault.
right. You kind of feel bad because you're like, all right, like, was I being like too pushy or too needy? But in reality, I'm like, wait a second, didn't they just tell me like 3 days ago this is what they were looking for? And we have been talking for like X amount of time. And yeah, I think you're right. I think it comes down to accepting that this is unfamiliar and that it's hard, but then also communicating that so that the person isn't left in the dark, and you're like, "Hey, like, listen, this is totally new for me. I'm not 100% sure if I like it. I might tell you in a week or two to kind of back off of it and just see where things kind of net out after that." And I think that's perfectly healthy.
I think it's perfectly healthy too, but I think a lot of people don't have the tools for confrontation or serious conversations. And this is where ghosting comes in, or they don't want to hurt the other person, but they end up hurting the other person. So it's just success in relationships is also your ability to sit with the uncomfortable and have the tense. And if you don't have those skills, which is okay, working on them is really beneficial, because you're bound to have one or two uncomfortable conversations in your relationships of like, hey, I need you to back off, or hey, I need more attention, being like perfect example of what people want to say and often don't.
And I do think people at their core are obviously they're good people and they want to learn, they want to grow. I think we're seeing more people now more than ever wanting to better themselves when it comes to relationships, self awareness, mental health, which I think obviously is super powerful. But with that said, there's so many people that are single that want to be in a relationship. Like, why do you think people are continuing to be single even though they're so passionate about like doing the inner work and learning how they can be better off in relationships?
Oh, I mean, I think there's so many variables to this. Part of it, I think, is when you do inner work, you become more selective and you understand the pond isn't as big as you thought it was because now you're not into, reading their mind and letting them violate your boundaries and like whatever. And so you become more selective. So automatically you might become a little harder. Some people lack the skills to have health relationships, so they end up being single. I think some people are really hurt, so their standards are really low, and then they pick partners that aren't good for them, and then they end up being single. But I think it goes back to the conversation of like, we've kind of dehumanized the whole process. And like, if you're talking to 15 people in your DMs that you're trying to get to know at the same time, the emotional bandwidth you would have to successfully do that would be really impressive. So although we have this freedom now to like taste, sample, and shop as we're dating, we also need to realize how much more attention, work, and effort that takes that most of us don't have. And so we're failing because we have all these options. We want to try all these options and we just cannot do that successfully. And so I think sometimes we like, take a bite that we can't chew on, like it's whatever the expression is, it's like a little too much. And so I think it comes to like the self-control aspect of it, depending what you're looking for. But if you're looking for that like intimate, deep, soul resonates with each other kind of relationship, then realizing like the time and the effort it takes to build that instead of just, giving up on it or trying to build it with like 7 people at the same time. That might be harder.
For sure. I mean, do you think that part of it though is that because of the rise of the popularity of wanting to work on yourself and healing and then talking about how you have to have a partner that kind of checks certain boxes for you and being aware of all those things that people have also created like unrealistic expectations of what
Of
a
course
partner.
they have. Yeah. And this is why I'm now talking about like how are you showing up in relationships, because I feel like that space of mental health is saturated. We know what we're looking for in other people. I think the space that's not as saturated is like how are you showing up and what are your red flags? And why would the type of person you want to date you? That's not meant to be a cruel question. That's a legitimate question in terms of like, if they're that self-enlightened and that emotionally attuned and all that good stuff, would they look at you and choose you in terms of your emotional availability and your skill set? And that's like a little bit of a brutal question, but I think it's an important one of like, would you date yourself? Do you fit your own standards that you're hoping someone else will fulfill? And no one's perfect. So if we're looking for perfection, we're all going to be single forever. Like
That's a totally different like question and way to put it, right? Because it's a great place to start from. In that, like, all right, like, would you date yourself? Like, would you like yourself enough to spend time with yourself alone? And if you can't spend time with yourself alone, like, how are you going to expect somebody else to want to spend time with that same person that you can't even be with by yourself? And I think it's important to get clear on that. I want to talk about red flags for a minute because I think that there's some red flags that might get potentially overlooked. I would say that for the most part, some common red flags are somebody constantly shows up late. Maybe they don't text you back for a few days. Maybe this person doesn't have a job and maybe, can't pay for certain things when they're out with you, or the way they treat you, or whatever. Those are like, I would say, are pretty obvious. What are some ones that maybe you've been more interested into looking into that maybe aren't so obvious that people need to pay attention to?
and I wouldn't say it's not obvious, but I think a huge red flag is inconsistency between behavior and words. So maybe they say all the right things and then the follow through is just not there, or they say all the right things, but they don't act in a way that they supposedly believe or think. Maybe they're like, I'm a feminist. Yes, I like love it when a woman is career oriented, when she makes her own money, when she's a boss. That's so hot, blah, blah, blah. Then she's like, oh, my schedule's really busy. Or, hey, if we ever have a kid, I want a nanny. Or, hey, I don't want a kid. Or, hey, and then all of a sudden, not so hot because he liked the idea of that. But in reality, he really wanted a stay at home mom, or he wanted someone who was always available when he was available. This is like an extreme example, but I think, yes, great. Maybe they're saying they really like the fact that you have a job and you're really driven. But if they show you with their actions, passive aggressive texts, put you down in public because you make more money than them, blah, 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 then you need to understand that there's a very big difference. And it's hard for us to reconcile that. So we often just ignore it. And so that's a really big one.
Yeah, and that's one that I think is so overlooked because people they get so infatuated with a person when they first meet them, and there's hope for a relationship. Specifically, if they haven't potentially done a lot of work on themselves, where they know that this is a normal thing when you meet somebody initially, is that you're going to have a little bit of a honeymoon phase. And then they overlook the fact that, like, hey, like this person said that they were going to do something and then they didn't do it. Or, hey, they said that they actually enjoyed doing these things, but the moment I go to ask them to do those things, they never want to do it. Like, what's that about? Instead, people they just fall into that trap of being like, oh, it's okay. Like, eventually they'll do it. Eventually they'll do it. And then they're married and they're like, man, like I haven't like, gone to a museum in 4 years. And this person said they love museums. Like, what the heck?
That's a great example. Yeah, absolutely. And I get that at the start, you're always putting your best foot forward and you're like, well, I don't hate camping. So it's not a lie to say I like camping, but like you camped once in your life and like you don't, and like we've all done things like that. But it's just so important to realize that when we do that, we're being dishonest and our words and actions are not going to line up. So as much as we want to observe that in other people, we need to observe it within ourselves as well. Like giving these fake promises, making sure that we sound like the most well-rounded human that's ever existed. It's just unfair. And they're going to be really disappointed once they find out you're not. So be honest about it.
And so blending the two recent things we've talked about in the sense of taking personal responsibility for what we can control and then also red flags. You talked about like one of your quote unquote toxic traits in a relationship is that you used to sweep stuff under the rug until like the relationship was going to end and then it was like boom, right? Like and I think figuring out like what's wrong with somebody or what somebody needs to work on potentially in a relationship can be very challenging. Like how do you recommend people begin to look within so that they can figure out like what are some of their toxic traits or red flags or whatever you want to call them so that they can present that in a relationship?
I think when you're done having shitty relationships, again, this is not to say that like people can't treat you shitty and they can't, manipulate you and then surprise you with how horrible they are, of course. But let's put that aside in terms of like, I was just done having relationships that fell apart that way. I was done not being happy in my relationships. Therefore, I had to figure out what I can do because choosing a different partner wasn't going to solve the problem. You can change partners every year, but at some point you need to admit to yourself that the only consistent in each relationship is you. And so I had this moment of like, okay, maybe I will still, come across a couple people that are not great, but how can I ensure that I'm doing my best in how I show up? And how can I make sure that like my shortcomings are not the reason the relationship ends? And a lot of my relationships I look back and I'm not like, I'm the only reason the relationship ended. No, but I definitely contributed a healthy amount to that. And so I think when you're done, when you feel done having the same relationships, that's a great motivation because no one can force you into self-awareness. I think you need to see the value of it.
Yeah, 100%. Because I think like change happens when like the state of your situation becomes so challenging that you're forced to say, okay, like, is this harder right now or is it harder to take a different route and make a change? And a lot of times what happens, like you said, like once you get any bad relationships, like that state that you're in is a lot harder than, choosing something differently. And then along those lines of, improving yourself from past relationships and becoming somebody who's a high value man, high value woman. What are some things that you think, like if you're looking for, take the example of you looking for in a male partner, what are some characteristics or traits that you look for in a male that you consider to be somebody of high value?
Oh, geez. I think you should have standards and expectations. I don't think expectations are bad as long as you're realistic. I don't know if you want to have like a checklist, but I think all the things that I really value in any human are applicable in a romantic relationship. But because I value self work so much, and obviously that's part of my work, and I've done a lot of work on myself the last decade or whatever, it's very important to me to find someone who values that, for example. So very similar views in terms of like, I think it's just them valuing what you value really boils down to of like, do they value boundaries? Do they value mental health? Do they value working on themselves? Do they value honesty, transparency? And so it's just that basic, like, are they compatible with me, but not in a way that's perfect? And I'm not saying, there shouldn't be any differences, but what I look for is really someone who's constantly trying and working on themselves. And I think that that's great because no one's perfect.
That's deep.
I don't know.
No one's perfect. And the reason I ask that is because I think a lot of times what happens is people base the value on somebody based on physical attraction, based on money, based on status, like based on like the external things.
Yeah.
And
No.
they hope that the rest will come together like after they get into a relationship with that person.
Look, I'm not under any like for example, love is blind. I don't think love is blind. I think you need to be attracted to the person. Like I don't think love is fully blind. But those things are not on top of my list. So that's like the stuff you'll be like, yeah, okay, like I need to be attracted to them. We need to have similar lifestyles. We need to be able to support each other's careers. That's all great and dandy, but unless you have that foundation, the inner work foundation, the soul foundation, to me everything else becomes irrelevant. So it's not the first thing I'll look for.
That makes sense. And I trust me, I've fallen into that trap before where you go solely after physical attraction and that's it. And nothing else matters. You're like, all right, like that's all that matters to me is how attractive this person is. And I don't care how many red flags they are. I'll wear them around my neck as a necklace.
Did that work out for you?
Did that work? No. I mean, I'm still a 35-year-old bachelor, so clearly no.
It hasn't worked out. Okay.
But no, it hasn't. But I also think, like you said, I don't think love is blind either. Like, I don't think it's all about emotional connection. I don't think it's all about values. I think you have to some level, be it physically attracted to the person that you're in a relationship with.
Of course, it's holistic and it's practical. There is very non-sexy practical things about compatibility. That's really important. That's equally important as that emotional connection. And so I think people usually look at small categories in terms of what they're looking for. And it's just important to really look at the overall picture and be honest when aspects of that picture don't fit and see how big on the hierarchy they are. And it's like, okay, maybe they work night shifts and that's not my favorite, but it's not a big deal. I can get over that. But maybe it's like, oh, they hold grudges or incredibly judgmental with people they don't like. Well, maybe I won't, overlook that. So it's just really depends on your hierarchy a little bit, but all of it is important.
It certainly is. And I think at the end of the day, like there has to be like a level of self-awareness to like what you're willing to not settle for. Like what are some non-negotiables in a relationship? And if one of them is physical attraction, there's nothing wrong with that. But just know that there's a chance if those other things don't line up that a relationship's not going to work out. And you have to be okay with that and making that choice that because you chose somebody solely based on how they looked and you didn't even take the time or didn't care to get to know them, like that could present some problems, early on in the relationship or down the road that, you're going to have to deal with.
Or when they change in their appearance as they age, like that's just things to consider.
Yeah. And I think on the theme of like being able to have open conversations and these things that are attractive to you as far as values and alignment with a partner, when it comes to boundaries, I think we talked about this last time, but I think it's very relevant now as well. And that's a big theme right now is that people are constantly, you hear people they're setting boundaries all the time. And I think sometimes the boundaries become counterproductive. Like what mistakes do you see with people when they're setting boundaries that are actually like causing them to not grow?
I think people are not always good at understanding discomfort versus pain and that it's okay to feel some discomfort. I also think people see boundaries as a wall rather than a blueprint in terms of like telling them where the walls are versus the doors versus the windows. So like, I just think that people don't fully understand what the purpose of a boundary is. And sometimes they isolate themselves to such an extent that no one can fulfill. Like, the boundaries get so many and so intense that you're just like by yourself chilling in a fence of boundaries. And I think that it's like, oh, that made me uncomfortable once, so now I'm going to set a boundary that's like pretty extreme. And it's like, yeah, you probably don't need to do that. Like it's also not, it's kind of become a convenient way to tell people off about anything you don't want or need, which is fine. But at the same time, it's, someone's going to do things you don't like, and that's also okay. Like, part of that is also just okay. Maybe your mom is going to be a little annoying and call you like, I don't know, twice a week. And yes, you can set that boundary, and maybe you should, but maybe you shouldn't. Maybe it's just like something you do because it means so much to her and it doesn't impact you negatively in any way except the fact that like it's a little annoying. So I just think like understanding why you set a boundary and when to set it and when to just be like, you know what, it's a little inconvenience for me, but it's not a big deal. So I'm not going to like make a big thing or even set a boundary around this, which I'm pretty sure is not a popular opinion, but not everything involves us being like, mother, please text me before you call and let's schedule our calls in because it's really inconvenient when you call me while I'm playing with my dog. Like, we don't always have to be that extreme about everything, but we can be. So it really depends what works for you.
Yeah, and I think it also makes it harder that a lot of times our parents' generations, they didn't live in this world where it was cool to talk about mental health as much as people talk about it now, and that people are talking about things like boundaries and healing and therapy. So being able to have compassion for them. And what I am gonna say, and this is just my opinion, is that I think you want to make sure that you're setting a boundary and you're not just trying to have a power trip. Because I think that can happen too, where people are feeling they're in a low place, or they maybe haven't come to terms with certain things in their past, and so they're all of a sudden just looking to gain power over a person to like fill their ego up a little bit, and that can be super dangerous in my opinion.
Yeah, but boundaries are not supposed to be manipulative. They're not supposed to be a power trip. And that's what I mean. People don't know sometimes what a boundary is. So when they use it to control the other person, when they do it as a power dynamic play, when they do it as a way to get back at their parents because now they are reflecting on their inner child and realize their parents weren't perfect, like, that's a misuse of a boundary. If it's something that's going to help you stay safe, if it's something that's going to nurture that relationship and that understanding, then great.
And so with that said, I want to put you in the hot seat really quick. Like, what are your thoughts on the inner child dynamic? In that, do you think it's healthy for people to, I mean, I know it's healthy to go back in your past, but to like look at your parents and then like almost like blame them for how you're behaving, and then like hold them hyper accountable, for like what's going on in your life?
Yeah, and that's become a trend lately. Look, I think inner child stuff, I'm so glad people are talking about it. I think it can be a very approachable way of just talking about your past and your wounds and all that good stuff. However, as you just use the word blaming, no. So you can definitely see that your parents screwed up and validate that and acknowledge that and realize the trauma or the wounds that occurred because of that. That being said, as an adult, you at some point have to take responsibility for your current life. So let's say that your parents got divorced when you were 8 and that was super traumatic for you. Absolutely, that is freaking traumatic. And that will definitely impact the way you see relationships. But if you're 25, 35, 45, and not trusting other people and having commitment issues and self-sabotaging anytime you get close to someone because of it, that has to become your responsibility. At some point, we can't blame our parents for the person we become. We can say it contributed to the person I become. It messed me up in these ways, quote unquote. However, what am I going to do about it? What am I going to do about my past that was very painful? What am I going to do with my parents' failures? How can I heal and move forward? Because not healing and not moving forward is our responsibility.
Right, 100%. And because it's easy to look in an event, I struggle with this, and people who know my story know where I would go with this. I'm not, for the sake of time, I'm not going to explain it, but it's easy to like focus on one event in your childhood and then use that as an excuse to just behave however you want for the rest of your life and just always point it back to that thing. instead of like acknowledging that that moment was painful and it was traumatic and yes, it did impact your adulthood and your childhood. However, it's not an excuse and it doesn't justify like certain behaviors and you continuing to act out in a negative way for the rest of your life because at the end of the day, like you're not going to be happy doing so.
No, it's not serving you. Like, I understand by giving fault where it's due. So if your parents really screwed up, yeah, of course, that instance was their fault. But I think living in that past and allowing that past to define you rather than inform you is only going to hurt you, right? Like, ultimately, it's not really going to hurt your parents. The one person that's going to suffer the most from not moving on is you. And so you deserve so much better. And I hope that people, because sometimes people are like, well, it was their fault. And I also think sometimes it's a way of punishing their parents of like, look what you did to me. And I totally understand all of it. But in the end, if you're not living a life that you want, you're the only one that can change that.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, like it's up to you. And while a lot of what happened to you may have been out of your control, might have been horrible, like the fact is you can't change what happened. The only thing you can do is learn and grow from it. And that's the only way to kind of reconcile with that, to create some level of happiness for yourself and your life. And speaking of like boundaries, I know like one of the things I saw you talk about is breakups. And like as like we kind of come to the tail end of our conversation, I want to talk about breakups. Like how does somebody know when it's time to exit a relationship? And then how can they effectively like break up with somebody? Because I think so many people have a hard time with this.
I mean, again, I don't think there's a formula, but what's really important is to realize how the relationship has impacted you holistically. If you walk away feeling guilty, sad, stressed, annoyed, jealous 90% of the time, and that's not how you want to be feeling all day, every day. So I think it's important to know the impact of the relationship. If you keep thinking about breaking up a lot, it might be a sign you want to break up. I think often the better question is, why are you staying in the relationship? If you've thought about breaking up with someone more than like 3 times in like a month, I would say that's super arbitrary, but I would say like, ask yourself, why am I staying in this relationship? Because often that's, you want to leave, but you're convincing yourself to stay. And so be very aware of the reasons why you're staying. And one of them is often like, I don't want to hurt this person. I don't know how to end this relationship, right? Not knowing how to end a relationship and wanting to be in a relationship are not the same thing. So when it comes to a breakup, it's never a nice feeling. No one's ever happy about it. I think showing up as gently, kindly, and as honestly as you can is probably the best way to go. And understanding that you're doing this person a service in terms of like, do they deserve to be with someone who doesn't want to be with them? Do they deserve to be with someone who's now going to kind of be a shitty partner until the other person breaks up with them? Like, none of the alternatives are better. And so also understanding like, this is probably, yes, it's going to hurt, but it's probably the most fair thing I can do. And in this relationship can help us instead of, staying it in and not realizing that that's probably going to hurt the person more in the long run.
That's a great mindset shift, right? Is like asking yourself, if you're so much caring about like whether that you're going to hurt the other person's feelings, like asking, is it fair to them for you to be in a relationship with them when you know that, how's it going to make them feel that if they knew that you really didn't want to be in a relationship with them? Like, how does that?
And they will know. Like, you're going to pretend, but the person's going to feel it.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, energy is everything, right? And you can certainly feel it. So let's just say that somebody decides, they walk away, they figure out how to break up with that person that they know they shouldn't be with. But what does the aftercare look like for that? Like, what are like a few things that they should do? What are a few things that they shouldn't do?
I think it's going to be on a person-to-person basis in terms of like what checking in and seeing what your actual needs are. But I think what can be helpful is to, one, write down all the reasons you broke up with someone. Because sometimes you'll freak out and be like, oh my God, this was the perfect relationship. And I see this all the time on people, like it's 6 months later and now they're romanticizing their ex and they're like, should I reach back out to them? It's like, yeah, no. So like write down, maybe, but write down the reasons why the relationship didn't work out. That can be really helpful to ground in facts. I think it's also helpful to think of all the lessons that you've learned and what meaning you attribute to this, because just because the relationship ended doesn't make it meaningless. Relationships don't become meaningful only if they last forever. Relationships are always meaningful, or they always have the potential of being meaningful. So you can go, what is the meaning that I attribute to this relationship? What did it, teach me? What are some of the great moments I had? And just try to see how you're going to move on and how that past is going to inform who you are now. Because you're now a different person than when you first started dating them. You can't be with someone for extended periods of time and go through so many new experiences and still be the exact same person. So see how you changed, what you like about that change, what you don't like about that change, and what you're going to carry with you.
Yeah, that's great advice. And this, as far as like what they shouldn't do, like a lot of times you see people, they might be stalking their ex on social media, or they might reach out. Like, what are a few things that people shouldn't do when it comes to that stuff?
So, figure out what distance you want from the person. Also, forcing friendships immediately might not be like, you might be like, we're so mature, we're just going to be friends right away. That might work for you, it might not. So, be careful with how you're moving forward. And if you're doing it just to like appease the other person or be the bigger person or whatever it is, I would say try to refrain from villainizing the other person as much as romanticizing them. Right. So like we construct all these narratives later that make us feel better. And again, it's just about honoring whatever was without having to come up with a new narrative that makes you feel better now. Yeah, contact is huge. I don't know if you're ever ready to move on. I don't know what that means, but not moving on before you're ready or before you want to. A lot of people are like, oh, you've been single for 3 months, get out there, blah, blah, blah. And so they do it because they feel they should, not because they genuinely want to. And so just trust in your own timing. And there's nothing wrong with taking a break. There's nothing wrong with starting to date right away. But if you're using other people as a way to process your breakup or as a way to avoid your emotions, yikes, it's probably not going to end very well. And you might hurt the other person in the process.
Yeah, there's a lot of things there to consider. One of the things that I think so many people struggle with is the villainizing part, I would say, right? And we've kind of talked about this, where people constantly will blame their ex. They'll constantly, point the finger at why the relationship didn't work out, instead of like looking within and being like, all right, like relationship's over, didn't work out. Like they could have done better, or I could have done better, but it's time for me to look at how I could have done better.
But we make others the villain so we can remain the hero. Right? Like usually that's the dynamic. It's like, if they're not the villain, then who is? And if there's just the two of you, then sometimes the answer is like, well, you. And so I think the reason we villainize others is because we want to maintain that role of a hero or the protagonist or whatever. And that's the issue of like realizing that you're probably not perfect and you contributed, and they don't need to be a villain in order for you to still feel good about the relationship and yourself. Yeah.
I also think we might have touched on this already, that it's hard for somebody when they're feeling like low about themselves to like after a breakup to actually say, like I had a part in this too. And like neither one of us are heroes right now. Neither one of us are villains. It's just life. And this was an unfortunate situation that didn't work out. So what are a few things that somebody can do after they go through a breakup to practice like a level of self-care so that they can focus on bettering themselves, so that when they start to date again, they're doing it from a healthy place and not from a place that's unhealthy?
Yeah, I think a lot of people need to learn to like themselves. I know self-love is like a really hot topic, but I feel like a lot of people don't know who they are. A lot of people don't accept who they are. A lot of people don't respect who they are. And a lot of people don't even like who they are. So asking everyone to love who they are is like a step way up there that we haven't reached. And I think that if you want to be in a healthy space where before you date someone, or something that can help you while you're dating someone, is really focus on that relationship with who you are. So figure out who that is, how you can accept and respect that person. How can you like that person? Because then if someone is mistreating a person you like or love, you're going to be more protective. You're going to have those boundaries come a lot more naturally. You're going to communicate. You're going to advocate. It's hard to do those things for someone you don't know or for someone you don't like. And so I think going back to like, what is my relationship like with myself? And when that feels a bit stronger, I think that can be super helpful when you start dating again, especially because any relationship we have will impact the relationship we have with ourselves. So if that was a negative impact, then you need to, rebuild that kind of trust with yourself before you move on in a way that will, feel safe and exciting.
that's it, right? Is being able to get to a place, I think, throughout the course of your life where you actually like yourself for who you are. And liking yourself doesn't just mean patting yourself on the back and telling yourself you're an amazing human every day. Liking yourself, loving yourself means holding yourself accountable too and saying, you could have done better, or you need to apologize, or you need to say no more, or you need to say yes more, or you need to stop pretending like you know everything, or whatever the case may be. Like that is true self love. Self love is putting yourself in a spot where, yes, you're happy with who you are, but you're also happy with telling yourself when you need to step up and do better.
I love that. Yes.
And I think along those lines, one of the things that people struggle with, I've been there, a lot of people I think that I know have been there, is they're so overcritical of themselves, specifically when they get out of a relationship, because when they get out of a relationship, their identity in a way they've lost their identity. Their self-image has changed a little bit. They've lost themselves. Have you ever personally struggled with being overly critical? And if you haven't, like, what would you say to somebody who is?
Oh, yeah. I mean, of course. Understanding that you're going to have flaws and that doesn't take away your worth is really important. And also treating yourself and speaking to yourself like you would talk to a friend. So I would never say half the crap I used to say to myself to another human being. And I know that's like a really cliche one of like, talk to yourself like you talk to your best friend. But I think that there's some truth to that in terms of like, you gotta watch out what you're saying. And if you're really, really critical, you need to observe it. Why are you so critical? What are the emotions that are triggering? Are you feeling insecure, scared? Is that like your inner critic is wanting you to be better because it's scared of failure? Like, what is happening? And I started to do this. I get my clients to do this. I apologize to myself. So if I'm being a dick, I'll go, I'm so sorry, Sara. You did not deserve to be criticized in that matter. What I was trying to say or communicate, or the feedback I was trying to give you is this. And so really just changing that inner dialogue until it becomes very natural to keep yourself accountable, to not criticizing yourself in a way that's not productive, right?
I mean, because that inner critic, it can either be used to your advantage or it can be used to your disadvantage. Like it can be used like to better yourself, right? And to say, okay, like here's where you can do a little bit better. But it can also go down this continuum.
Yeah, I mean, it's feedback versus criticism, right? And it's like, what is your intention? Is it to tear you down or is it to help you move forward and become a best version of yourself? If what you're saying is tearing you down, then you don't need to say it.
And I think also along those same lines, people, they have like a hard time with just their own like self-image, I think not just being overly critical, but just like they look at themselves in the mirror and maybe they see a version of themselves that they're just not happy with, or they see a version of themselves that feels lost. They see a version of themselves that maybe isn't where they want to be in life. Like, what are a few things that you think somebody could do? Maybe it's a journaling practice, maybe it's just some words that you could share to help them accept that that's part of reality sometimes when they're going through something hard, but also help them escape that trap that a lot of people fall into.
Yeah, look, it's very normal and it's also very difficult. And just because it's normal doesn't mean it's not difficult. I think something that is a comforting thought to me is that chances are my actions led to me looking in a mirror and feeling lost, annoyed, disappointed, upset, whatever it is. But that's also a comforting thought because it means that if I change my actions, I can create a very different version of myself. And I find that very empowering in terms of like, okay, everything I've done has led to this. Now I get to choose what I do because I want it to lead to something else. And being empowered by how much freedom and how much responsibility we genuinely have. Maybe you don't know where you want to go from here or how to get there. And as you said, I think a journaling practice can be really helpful. Something I get people to do all the time is ask yourself every day, what did I learn about myself today? Like really boiling it down to the basics. Like we want all these really big conceptual things, but it's like, okay, let's work on that relationship with the self. And sometimes it's just as easy as like, hey, what did I learn about myself today? Okay, I learned that I get triggered by this. I learned that I really like mint chocolate ice cream. I learned that I am very not turned on when a girl does X, Y, and Z. And it's really great because it gives you like this, I'm paying attention to myself. I'm paying attention to the life I'm living. And once you get a clear idea of who you are, it might be easier to make those changes in a way that will align with you. That was like a lot.
No, but it's so good because I think at the end of the day, like it's the path to self-discovery and it's being able to understand like why you're feeling a certain way about yourself when you're looking in the mirror and then figuring out ways to better yourself, learn more about yourself so you can apply what you've learned to like step into that next version of you, to step into maybe that person that you maybe lost during that relationship. And I love your advice. And I think it's a good way to kind of close our conversation. And so, Sarah, I wanted to thank you for coming on and I loved our chat. I think people are going to get a lot of value out of it. If people want to connect with you more, I know you're pretty active on Instagram and I know you got a book coming out soon as well. Like, where can people learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, you can look me up on my website. There'll be book information there, but obviously I'm most active on Instagram, which is at millennial.therapist. My website, Sara Kuburic.
Let's go. I will make sure to post the links to your social channels and to your website in the show notes. And for those listening, what I invite you to do is to share a takeaway. Maybe it was something that Sarah shared when we talked about the three relationship truths that people don't necessarily want to hear but need to hear. Maybe it was something that we said in terms of personal accountability, boundaries. Maybe it was something that we said, about just doing the work and maybe gaining some self-awareness around, certain patterns in past relationships and how you're going to show up differently. Whatever the takeaway was, tag Sarah, tag myself, because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst. We'll see you next time.